Does God exist? Does God care if he does exist? And if he does exist and he does care, does he still work in the world today? I think that these are all questions that we have probably at some point in our life asked. Whether or not it was outright or just perhaps a questioning in our own minds whenever we are going through some difficult situation, some frustration, some tragedy that we have encountered. And today's feast of Pentecost gives an answer to those questions. And the answer that it gives is a resounding yes. God is real, he does exist, he does care, and he does still work in the world today. When we come to this Feast of Pentecost, we conclude the Easter season with it. And just last week we celebrated the Ascension. So we celebrated the event of Jesus, the risen Lord, returning to the Father after 40 days of appearing to his disciples after the resurrection. Now, traditionally, I mentioned last week, the Ascension is not celebrated on Sunday, but on Thursday. And so there are 9 days between Ascension Thursday and Pentecost Sunday. And those 9 days between those two feasts is where we get the idea of a novena, right? Praying for a specific intention for 9 days. And we get that from there because that is exactly what the apostles did during those 9 days. Right? They prayed. Jesus ascended to the Father. They find themselves alone, but he had promised to be with them always. And so they prayed intensely for those 9 days, specifically for the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. And so today's Feast of Pentecost is that sending forth of the Spirit, right? We hear that in our readings, that the Spirit descended upon the apostles as tongues of fire. And so in this outpouring of the Holy Spirit, the apostles were given the grace specifically to proclaim the good news, to preach the gospel. And so that's why after Pentecost, the apostles go out and proclaim the gospel to the ends of the earth. Now, this was a real event that happened 2,000 years ago, but we celebrate it every year to remind us that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit continue to pour out their grace upon us. Now, how do they do it, right? We don't see, maybe you have seen it. If you have, come tell me about it, right? I've never seen tongues of fire coming down from heaven. So how does God send the Holy Spirit to us today? He does so through the sacraments, right? That is how grace comes into the world and comes into our lives. In fact, the sacraments, right? We can't look out and see the Spirit. But the sacraments are visible signs of invisible realities. They are outward signs of things that happen inwardly. Right? The best example that I like to talk about is baptism. Right? We cannot see sin being taken away. That is something that is beyond our ability to see. But we can see someone pouring water, right? Washing with water. And we know, right, from our regular earthly lives that when we pour water, it cleans, right? It purifies. And so that outward sign of washing a person shows what's happening inwardly, that they are being purified of their sin. Right now, the sacraments, for the most part, are carried out, are performed by men who are consecrated to God. Men who are set apart for this purpose, set apart for service. Right? And that setting apart for service is itself one of the 7 sacraments. Right? We call it the sacrament of holy orders. That a bishop, right, a successor of the apostles who had the tongues of fire come down on them, lays hands on men to consecrate them, to make them holy, to set them apart for service to God's people. Right? And so we receive grace through this sacrament of holy orders. It is a working of the Holy Spirit in the world, right? An answer to that question. Does God still work? Yes. God does still work. Because of the ascension, right, Christ is no longer walking around on earth as the apostles saw him. But Christ is still in the world through us. Right? Through each of us who is baptized, Christ continues to work in the world. That's why he gave the disciples the command to go out and to proclaim the gospel, right? He's in heaven, he can't do it anymore, so he uses us. He uses us to proclaim the good news of the kingdom in the world today. And so he needs us. He needs the baptized, right? I've said before that we are other Christs. We are Christ in the world today, proclaiming the good news that he proclaimed 2,000 years ago. Now, traditionally, the Feast of Pentecost is related to another of the sacraments, right? The sacrament of confirmation. Because through confirmation, right, we receive the grace that we need to proclaim the good news of the gospel. But the sacrament of, or the Feast of Pentecost, is tied to all of the sacraments in a broad sense, right? It's a giving of the Holy Spirit. And so we can say that that sacrament of holy orders, or ordination, is very much a type of Pentecost, right? A sending of the Spirit. Right? Particular men walking around in the world today, hear and respond to a call. Right? It is a fruit of prayer. God sends his Holy Spirit to these men in prayer. He prompts them. He stirs up his Spirit within them. And they respond to that call. Right? God is still working in the world in this way today. This prayer, through which men hear this call and respond to it, is both personal and intercessory. Right? So everyone in the world can pray for me to hear a call, but if I'm not praying myself, I'm not going to hear it. And so there has to be personal prayer. Right? This is why, part of the reason why I took time every Sunday for the past several months to speak to our high school students about prayer. We have to be formed in prayer. We have to know how to pray, and we have to do it if we want to know what God is calling us to do. And so there has to be that personal aspect of prayer so that I can hear what God is calling me to do. But when we're talking about holy orders, right, the sending of the Spirit in that way to set men apart to serve God's people, there also has to be this aspect of intercessory prayer. That every single one of us has the task, has the responsibility to pray for the outpouring of the Holy Spirit for those men who are being called to serve in the priesthood, who are called to serve as deacons. Right? We as the community of believers, just like the apostles came together and begged for the outpouring of the Spirit, we have to do that too. Right? We have to pray daily for God to continue to call men to the priesthood, and for those men to hear that call and to have the courage to respond to it. Right? Because it is a daunting call to receive. And so this coming together of the community to ask God for the sending forth of the Spirit in that way continues, right? Those 9 days between the Ascension and Pentecost. Continues to ask for God to send out his Spirit. And at that moment of ordination, right, when the bishop lays his hands on those men's heads and then prays the prayer of ordination, God the Father and the Son once again send the Holy Spirit into the soul of that man being ordained. I'll never forget whenever we went through this the sacraments class in seminary. I was studying away and I came home for the class right before me to be ordained. And I remember watching, saying, there it is. Right? The bishop laid hands on them and said the prayer. Those men are now priests. They don't look any different on the outside, except maybe a little grin on their face. They still struggle with the same things. They still have the same human imperfections. But now they are set apart to proclaim the gospel. They are set apart to help make holy. Right? And that sending of the Spirit in ordination leaves a mark on the person's soul. Right? I am not the same person that I was almost 7 years ago before the bishop ordained me. My soul has been changed. Right? I am different because of that laying on of the hands of the bishop and that sending of the Holy Spirit. So yesterday, there was one man from our diocese that was ordained to the transitional diaconate. So deacon now, Nick Wares, a graduate of Notre Dame High School. Some of you probably know him. He's from Maine. Right? Someone from our midst. Someone that people in this town grew up with, went to school with, was called to serve at the altar. And the bishop laid hands on him, the Holy Spirit came into him, and he was a changed man. Right? God still works in the world. And so we are grateful today to God for the gift of Deacon Ware, for the gift of all of our deacons and priests and bishops. But we don't become complacent in our gratitude. Right? We need more men to serve at the altar. Right? Me and Father Rosa are tired and we can only do so much. We need more priests. Right? And God is continuing to call them, but we need to have them respond. Right? And so our call today, this Feast of Pentecost, is to live in that time between the Ascension and Pentecost. Right? To daily beg God to continue to send out His Holy Spirit, especially into the hearts of men who are feeling that call to the priesthood. We know that God is generous. We know that He wants to continue to send out His Spirit, not just enough, but He wants to send out His Spirit in abundance. Right? He wants us to overflow with the gift of His Spirit. But we have to ask Him to do so. We have to recognize that need and ask Him to do so. Right? And we ask God to send His Spirit not just for other people. Right? You pray for me and you're grateful for me and I'm grateful for that. Continue to do that. Don't stop praying for me. But we have to pray for God to send us priests, and we have to be willing for us to maybe be the one that's called, or for your children to be the one that's called. Right? Many people have no problem praying for vocations and saying, we need more priests. It's so great when people become priests. But then when their son says, hey, I think I might have a call to priesthood, they back off. So, whoa, this isn't what I prayed for. I prayed for someone else. Right? You as parents have to form your kids in the ways of the faith. And you have to be willing to offer them to God to serve at the altar if that is what He is calling them to do. And if you wonder if you're going to be happy if that happens, talk to my parents, but particularly my dad. My dad questioned me, not because he was upset, but I had been talking about being a professor of engineering for so long, he questioned me when I said I wanted to go to seminary. Today you will not find a happier man. Right? He is so proud of me, and he tells me often how proud he is of me to be a priest. Right? And so trust that God will make your child happy, and that God will make you happy if that is what He is calling you to. Right? We need more priests. We have 122 parishes in our diocese. Each one of them wants their own priest. Most of them want more than one priest. We have over 350,000 Catholics in the Diocese of Lafayette. And we have just around 20 men studying in the seminary. We need more men to step up and to answer this call. Right? We can do better, and we need to do better. Because without priests, we have no Eucharist, no sacraments. Without the sacraments, without the Eucharist, we have no church. And so today we renew our commitment to praying, right? To begging God to send forth His Spirit, to renew that gift of His Spirit as He sent it at Pentecost 2,000 years ago. And this weekend, as we celebrate Pentecost and ordinations, we're reminded in a tangible way that God is real, right? That He does still care, and He does still work in our world today in an incredibly powerful way.